Welcome to episode number 100 of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. John Alden with you, as always, and glad to have you on board for the 100th episode of the show. And I know I've kind of talked about it off and on this week, but I can't believe that I've already made 100 of these episodes. And I don't know how many of these episodes will exist before it's all said and done, but if you'd have told me that I would ever have 100 episodes of anything a few years ago, I don't know, maybe I'd believe you, maybe I wouldn't. I don't know how I would feel about it back in the day, though. But hey, we're here, and I'm glad you are as well. And we got plenty of things, as always, to discuss. Alec Lasley will be joining today. I know I kind of initially hoped on having like a super special guest on for this episode. I told you guys earlier this week that I did reach out to Tom Crean. That unfortunately fell through and won't be able to happen. Maybe sometime in the future. But honestly, after getting John Fanta on Monday and realizing how big of a hit that ended up being, I was like, maybe I could do a bigger guest some other time. So I'm not putting all of my eggs into one basket for 1 week. But either way, Alec is always a great guest to have. Of course, somebody affiliated with HoosierIllustrated.com as well. So it's always nice to have that. And plenty of good conversation to share with you with basketball and football things from our discussion here in just a little bit. Also, I teased at the end of yesterday's or Wednesday's show that there would be some changes coming on my end of this show. And I'll go ahead and further elaborate on what that means. And I'll also mention it again at the end of the show. But beginning next week, and some of you are not going to like this. And honestly, maybe none of you will like this, but I'll go ahead and say the good part of this really quick. The show is not going away. In Touch with Indiana Sports is going to continue on. And the reason for these changes is not because of anything bad that I did or bad that anyone did. It's more so just because I've been given yet again more responsibilities at my other job that I reference quite a bit, my iHeart job. And again, it's all good things, but at the same time, when you add more to one plate, sometimes you have to take away from another. And what that means is beginning next week, In Touch with Indiana Sports will only release one time per week, but it will be a weekly show. It just will no longer be 3 shows per week. And I don't know if that will be a permanent thing. I don't know if I'll go back to doing 3 or if it will just kind of vary depending on things. But the timing of it isn't too terrible, at least when it comes to when you think of the sports, cycle and calendar and things, because basketball's kind of winding down, and we all know football's been done for a few months now, and we're heading into what is kind of known as the college sports dead period. And maybe it's not officially known as that, but the big sports that people really care about the most, football and basketball, are going into their off seasons. And football's been in it for quite some time. They're in spring football now, but outside of baseball and softball, among a few other non-revenue sports, there's not a lot of active things that people really want to hear about. I'm not saying people don't care about baseball or softball or other things, but the vast majority of people listen to these types of shows for the big guns, for football, for basketball, that sort of thing. And so the timing of this isn't terrible. What will happen moving forward is, like, whenever I release the show, as of right now, the plan is for the regular releases to be on Monday or Tuesday. That could fluctuate, and that may change. But as of right now, that's kind of my plan moving forward. So maybe this coming Monday, things won't feel much different. But when you get to Wednesday and Friday and don't have a new show, that's when things will kind of probably set in. And again, I apologize if this is something you've grown to enjoy having 3 days a week. Just with added responsibility at work, my other job, I should say. Sometimes you have to balance things out, and especially with all of you all. I say all of you, those of you who have been around long enough also know that I have a baby on the way, and the baby will be here in about a month or so. And so that's also something I have to take into consideration. I've got to be able to have time for my new child and my wife and all that good stuff. And so hopefully you all are very understanding. And if you're upset, I do understand that as well. Hopefully you're not mad at me about it. At least I hope you wouldn't be. But I will do my best each and every show that releases weekly from here on out to give you, my best thoughts and opinions on things. I'll try to make the shows as entertaining as I can. As always, I'll try to get plenty of good guests and hopefully a variety of different guests. I'm hoping as the show continues, to move forward, that I can continue to bring on more people who have never made appearances on this show. I'll still always have the regulars, but at the same time, I like to, branch out like I've tried to do over the last few, couple of months and that sort of thing. And so that's kind of how things will look moving forward. And again, I just hope you guys are, not too upset about things. But again, I understand if you are, because if I were a listener to any show and things were changing, people don't always, and myself included, don't like change. So I totally get it. But as I've mentioned already, I will still do my very best to bring it every week that I release one of these. And that might mean that shows are longer. I'm going to try on occasion, maybe more often, to have multiple guests per show, because I'm going to try to cover the entire week upcoming for Indiana sports, and not just IU. That of course will always be the primary focus, but we had Tyler Smith on. The Indiana Pacers will be in the playoffs soon, and we'll continue to keep an eye on that as that progresses. And of course, the Colts, as hopefully the Colts can do something a little more, man, this upcoming fall. But the way that they've kind of handled the offseason and their moves with bringing in Daniel Jones, and it just seems like they don't really know what they're doing. And I'm not going to dive too deep into that right now, just because I've really just kind of I'm just laying the groundwork right now for the rest of today's show. But I did have to go ahead and mention that because I know I briefly mentioned it on Wednesday's show, and I don't know how many of you listened all the way to that portion on Wednesday. And I know hopefully I was able to get this out soon enough so that people could hear about the changes that were coming after today. One last thing on that. It's also wasn't the plan to do 100 episodes and then drop off. That's just purely a coincidence. I promise it is purely a coincidence. But let's go ahead and just kind of move into the real content for today. And I guess we'll start with where we've normally been starting for the last few weeks, or really the last few months when you really think about it. Indiana basketball, but we're starting today with the transfer portal. Since Wednesday's episode, or since the recording of Wednesday's episode, I should say, we've had a few more guys jump in the transfer portal. First of all, we also know that Gabe Cupps has chosen where he is going to end up, that being in his home state of Ohio, going to Ohio State University, or should I say the Ohio State University, as I cringe a little inside it. Maybe you did as well. But I'm kind of surprised, but also not surprised by that move. I'm not surprised he's in the transfer portal. I'm not surprised that anybody is in the transfer portal. I want to get that out there. But I always kind of thought that Gabe Cupps would decide to go down a level, because I don't really know. And again, I don't really know what Ohio State's roster looks like, but I'm not sure how his playing time will change from Indiana to Ohio State. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he'll be highly prioritized in Columbus. We'll have to wait and see. And of course, Indiana will face him in the coming seasons, as long as he stays with the Buckeyes. We've also learned that Miles Rice has entered the transfer portal. I think I can't remember if Kanan Carlisle was already in the portal or not for Indiana. But essentially, if we're going to make this easy, there's only one current scholarship player left on Indiana's roster right now, that being Bryson Tucker. And, we saw a lot of really good glimpses of Tucker through the first half to 2/3 of this season. It looked like he was going to have a promising career, and then all of a sudden he just disappeared from the lineup. So it'll be interesting to see how his conversations with Darren DeVries go, if he's somebody who ends up staying on the roster. I think it would be kind of cool to have one person, from the previous regime stick around, not to show them the ropes or anything, because Tucker, if he does stick around, Bryson Tucker, he's going to have to learn all new, ways of going about doing things with Coach DeVries if he does stick around. But it would be nice just to kind of have that link between two different coaching regimes as opposed to having a completely different roster. Because when you look at football, even though Curt Cignetti brought in his entire, who he wanted to bring in from JMU and his transfer portal class, you still had a decent amount of guys who stuck around. And some of those guys ended up kind of not, panning out the way we thought they would, like Donovan McCulley. He ended up being, before Curt Cignetti came, he was Indiana's most coveted wide receiver. And a lot of Indiana fans, myself included, were worried that Donovan McCulley was going to leave and not give Cignetti a chance. Well, he did stick around and ended up not really being a massive part of the offense. And also another surprising thing, in another surprising development, it didn't matter because Indiana had so many playmakers, not only, throughout the entire team, but specifically on the wide receiving end. So, and now you see him going where a lot of people thought he was going to end up in the first place, and that being at Michigan. So maybe if Bryson Tucker stuck around, maybe it would be hard for him to get off the bench. Who knows? Or maybe he would, under this new staff would flourish. And I think he was doing good things under Mike Woodson. But when you're a freshman, it's kind of hard to kind of carve out your role no matter who you're playing under. So I hope Bryson Tucker sticks around just to simply have that link between regimes. I don't know how crucial it is, maybe not crucial at all, to have somebody like that around, because I've mentioned it multiple times. You'll hear me mention it again during Alec's segment. You don't need to have guys from the previous roster to be successful in year one with a new head coach. In basketball, for sure, definitely a little bit different in football with the amount of players that are on a roster. But with basketball, you can completely start with a blank canvas and find success. And I'm looking forward to see what happens with this. When Darren DeVries ends up bringing in his guys, we already kind of have a decent idea at who some of those initial transfers will end up being. The first being, his son, Tucker DeVries from West Virginia. And one of the more highly coveted transfers in the transfer class as of right now, because, of course, as teams continue to lose in the NCAA tournament, that'll be another thing to keep an eye on as more of those guys jump in the portal. And then you've also got Connor Enright, I don't know how to say his name, from DePaul. Very interesting. I didn't realize how good of a prospect he was, because DePaul was not a very good team this year, but it doesn't always necessarily mean that he's a bad player. And so apparently he's set to visit Indiana next week. And it is likely, at least according to 24/7 Sports, the crystal ball currently has him 100% projected to end up committing to Indiana. So that's the current movement. And that's not a lot of movement, of course, for Indiana when it comes to the transfer portal. Again, as I said earlier this week, I think next week will be the first really, really big week. There's no other way to say it, I guess, for seeing Indiana land some guys. And I'm not saying they're going to have their entire roster filled out next week, but you'll see a good chunk of guys, I believe, at the very least start, setting up visits to Indiana or even just committing. I don't know. I don't remember how long this process took last year. It was a lot more lengthy, but the transfer portal window is a bit smaller this year by 15 days. Now, I know that doesn't necessarily matter when it comes to how long those guys stay in the portal. It's more so how long you have to enter your name into it. But either way, we'll have to see. I'll be curious to see what the grand total of players in the transfer portal is as opposed to last season, if that number is going to be bigger or smaller. Because with no rules or any real restrictions around it, I mean, why wouldn't you put your name in the portal? I mean, I guess one of the primary reasons would be, because if you do that, it kind of gives your current coach the ability to recruit over you just because they have to prepare for if you're going to leave. So we'll have to wait and see what ends up happening. Excuse me with that. Hopefully, apologies for for burping into the microphone. If that is indeed what I ended up doing. That's, is what it is. But I'm going to take a quick pause to have another sip of my coffee. A lot of weird energy today from me, I feel like. I don't mean to come off that way, but maybe it's because it's episode number 100 and all these changes are coming and that sort of thing for me. But either way, we'll continue forward. A couple more Indiana basketball things I want to mention, and then we'll get into our conversation with Alec Lasley. And I won't spend too much time on these things, I don't think. But one thing to keep in mind, I saw this, I think Mike Nizelek put this up on social media the other day, but Indiana basketball is eligible for another foreign tour this offseason. And I believe that you're allowed to take those. It's either every other season or every, now I'm confusing myself because I know they did it in Mike Woodson's first year, but maybe it's every 4 years. So maybe every other season is nonsense. Don't quote me on that. Either way, this year Indiana is eligible to go on a foreign trip, and last time they went to the Bahamas, ended up being a good experience for them. But I kind of want to see them go somewhere unique. Like, we know Purdue's done their stuff up in Canada before. I'd like to see them do something a little out of the ordinary. And I don't know how likely that is. I don't know if there's any sort of restrictions on where you can go when it comes to doing these foreign trips. But that will give us a glimpse of what this Indiana team could look like before we even get to November. Now, it also gives us a chance to overreact to a team that will be far from polished, right? But also it can't hurt to have the extra reps going into a brand new regime with Darren DeVries, to have some extra real competition. And I know the games don't count for anything, but to actually play in a game against another opponent before you get to November, when things really do ramp up, that can only be a good thing for this upcoming Indiana basketball team. So looking forward to seeing what they'll end up doing. I do believe I saw that DeVries does intend on utilizing Indiana's ability to do a foreign tour. So I'm sure we'll get some information about that in the coming weeks or months. I can't remember when they announced Mike Woodson and his decision to go to the Bahamas. And I think, actually, never mind. I was going to go down a certain path, but I don't think it would have made any sense. So I'll just back that truck up right now. Another thing that you've seen other schools utilize, and I don't think Indiana's done this yet, whether it be for football or for basketball, but it is expected that DeVries will find someone to be a quote unquote GM for this Indiana basketball team. Someone who will kind of make financial decisions and probably some roster decisions, when it comes to helping build a team. And I don't know who that would end up being. I don't even know who would be like who Indiana would target for that role. But it will be interesting to see how that ends up playing out. And I'm curious too. Put this in the comments if you want. If you're Darren DeVries and you're hiring an Indiana basketball GM, who are you calling first? Put that in the comments if you don't mind, and we'll discuss. I'll discuss some of your responses on Monday or Tuesday's show, whenever next week's show ends up releasing. Excuse me, almost down the wrong pipe. I do think, speaking of YouTube comments, we'll get into a few more towards the end of the show, as we've been doing the last several days. And as always, I love the comments. Been getting several recently, and I love getting enough comments to where I can share different things each episode. So for as long as that's something I can feasibly do, which I feel like it always will be, please keep them coming. Share your opinions, thoughts on anything I discuss, anything I say, whatever it might be, and I'll share those on as many shows as I decide to do that for. So keep them coming, and I'll keep sharing them. All right. I think with that being said, everything else I've got on my list of things to discuss, I think we'll do that on the other side of the Alec Lasley segment. So we'll go ahead and transition into that now. He and I continue to discuss Indiana basketball, Coach DeVries, all the stuff we've been talking about a lot recently, and plus a little bit of Indiana football stuff that will kind of be a good segue into what I want to begin with on the other side. So without further ado, I'll let that conversation roll right now. Joining us now from HoosierIllustrated.com, it is the publisher of Hoosier Illustrated, Mr. Alec Lasley. Welcome back to In Touch with Indiana Sports.
How you doing, John?
I'm doing well. This is probably the warmest day we've had since, we turned over to the spring season. I'm planning on and this isn't at all sports related. I'm planning on going out and pulling some weeds later. I got to get the yard ready. Got to do old
I did
man
I did
things.
a little bit of that this morning. So
Yeah.
we are on the same page. That's the good and bad thing about springtime is
Yeah,
you're excited about the
landscaping,
weather,
cutting
but
the
yeah.
grass, there's good and bad that comes with it, but that just means more work for some people. But either way, you and I have not spoken at least on the record, if you will, since Indiana had hired Darren DeVries as its new head basketball coach. What was kind of your initial impression whenever you figured out, or found out, I should say, that Indiana was going to move in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, everything kind of pointed to him going to Iowa, right? And it seemed like, once things were shot down at that point, along the lines of more or less the NIL not being there for Iowa, that was kind of the main talking point and the resources from the basketball side of things. At that point, everything kind of pointed to Indiana. He wasn't going to be going back to West Virginia at that point, and then Iowa kind of put all their eggs into the Ben McCollum basket, which at that point seemed like a sure thing. And from that perspective, I think it was exciting because I do think when you look at both Darren DeVries and when you look at Ben McCollum, I'm way more on the side of Darren DeVries is going to succeed in Indiana than what Ben McCollum would have done, and that comes from being able to flip programs the way that he's done. Obviously, what he was able to do in one season at West Virginia, but him being able to build a program at Drake, right? I mean, a lot of people look at what Ben McCollum did this year, but forget that Drake was not a program realistically before what Darren DeVries was able to do there in his 6 years. So the resume speaks for itself, but more importantly, the Power Four experience that he had under Dana Altman and then under Greg McDermott as an assistant at Creighton for 17, 18 years is something that I think is invaluable when it comes to being able to take on this level of not only just pressure, but being a head coach in the Big Ten, being a head coach at the Power Four level. Something that Ben McCollum has not had yet. And so when you are comparing resumes from looking at what Curt Cignetti has to what kind of everyone wanted from a basketball coach, everyone was just so quick to look at what Ben McCollum did and say, that's the basketball Curt Cignetti. And in my opinion, that is
I was one of those people.
extremely, yeah, and it didn't make a lot of sense to me because the one thing that Curt Cignetti had was the experience as a coordinator at the Power Four level. And again, I keep coming back to this, and that's something that Ben McCollum never had. That's something that Ben McCollum didn't have, anywhere in Division One up until last year. Flip side, Darren DeVries has had numerous years of experience as a head coach now or an assistant at the Division One level, at the Power Four level, and brings with him again those 18 years on the bench alongside Dana Altman and Greg McDermott that I think a lot of people are kind of looking over. But when we heard what DeVries was talking about in his introductory press conference, he used a lot of the same terminology, a lot of the same language that Curt Cignetti used, being very process oriented
Yes.
in the day-to-day structure. And it was a very systematic approach to how he does things, even getting down to the nitty-gritty of, having practices a little bit shorter than what typical coaches have. We heard the exact same thing from Curt Cignetti. You get in, you do your work, and you get out, right? And that keeps players fresher throughout the years or throughout the season, and then obviously going into what you hope is postseason play, and not wearing them down earlier on by kind of running them into the ground in practice. So it's little things like that that I think when you really look at what you wanted from a coach, he's not the sexy name, right? That a lot of people wanted when the coaching search started, but I think it's a very, very good hire. And I think a lot of fans are going to be extremely excited about the style of play and, more importantly, the effort and the passion and the intensity that's brought back now to the program every single time this team steps on the floor, because I think a lot of that was lost over the last year when it comes to on the floor experience and preparedness when you're looking at Indiana.
And it is going to be interesting. You're going to see a lot of people throughout next fall and, of course, into the winter part of the season as well. Just throughout the season in its entirety, you're going to see a lot of people watching not only Indiana as Indiana fans, but they're going to be keeping an eye on what Ben McCollum's doing at Iowa, because you're going to get that kind of comparison, I think, from fans just because you kind of knew it was going to be one of those two guys. And what's kind of funny to think about, if Indiana hires McCollum, or if well, I should say if Iowa hires DeVries, then you're more than likely seeing McCollum in Indiana in role reversal. So you're going to see a lot of people comparing those two seasons specifically next season, and so that'll be something interesting to watch. Another thing that's in the immediate right now with Indiana, of course, is the abundance of players in the transfer portal. And I've seen some people online kind of, I don't want to say panic maybe, but just kind of be
Oh,
kind of
they have.
concerned. Yeah, I haven't dove
There's
into the entirety. I kind of, I tend to stay in my lane sometimes, Alec, when it comes to people I follow. And thankfully, I don't follow a ton of people that panic. But when you click on that hashtag IUBB, you can find all sorts of things that you maybe wouldn't have expected to run into, like the panicking fans. But I think one thing that's important to note, and I'm sure you'll elaborate on this as well, is that nowadays, when you go through any coaching change, you're more than likely going to be building an entire roster from the ground up. I mentioned Louisville and Kentucky multiple times, how both of those programs with Pat Kelsey and Mark Pope started from 0 returning players last year. And both of those teams had probably a whole lot more success than they ever anticipated having this season. Now, Louisville bowed out of the tournament a little earlier than they probably would have hoped for, but Kentucky, of course, is still playing as they're vying for a spot in the Elite Eight tonight. So just kind of your thoughts right now on this, on where Indiana's at when it comes to the transfer portal.
Yeah, look, I mean, outside of this morning that just happened within the last minute or two, Cam Williams, one of the most sought after transfers from Tulane, committed to Kentucky. Outside of him, no one of true kind of substance has committed anywhere, right? You may have
Yeah.
some guys commit here and there, but there are 1,200 players in the portal. There are probably 20 guys who have committed. And when you look at what Indiana has to do, they have to make sure that, a lot of people forget, right? The first week that Darren DeVries took the job, all these guys were on spring break from an Indiana player perspective, right? So a lot of the team meetings and the player meetings took a little bit longer to actually get back into once the players got back onto campus. So, right, you kind of push things out maybe a couple of days. Just because anyone hasn't committed yet doesn't mean that Indiana's not making progress, right? I mean, you have the expectation, the full expectation that Tucker DeVries is going to be at Indiana, right? So there's one. You now have the process going on with Luke Goody trying to get a fifth year. So there's two that's, you're at least in progress. Something's in motion. And then the third, Connor Enright, the DePaul transfer, who has a visit set up. How many programs have had a kid come in and visit already or have a scheduled visit? Not a lot, right? You probably look at Owen Freeman as the only kind of big name who ended up committing from Iowa to Creighton as a guy who's already visited somewhere. So a lot of these guys haven't even set up visits. He's going to be visiting, Connor Enright is next Tuesday. Played under Darren DeVries at Drake for 2 years before spending last year at DePaul. So you have things in motion. There's no need to panic, because when you look at when a lot of these first year head coaches in new programs, when they get commits, it's typically 3-4 weeks after they get kind of settled into the job. They have to deal with getting the staff in order. They have to deal with making sure that if there are players who want to come back from the current roster, how they fit in with what system they want to run, right? So there's a lot of things that go into this, and that doesn't mean that they're not having conversations with recruits, with portal targets, with anything, any agents, all like that, every single second of every single day. You already have Trent Sisley coming in. He's reconfirmed that commitment, so he's done what he's needed to do, and he's continuing to get things in motion. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a commitment, in the next week. But I also wouldn't be surprised if you see the majority of the roster come together next month. So you don't need to worry if you're an Indiana fan, because again, not many players have announced where they are going to be committing at this point. So Indiana is not behind by any realm of the imagination.
This may be tough for you to gauge, but I do want to ask anyway. If any of the guys who are currently in the transfer portal decided to come back, who would you think that would most likely end up being?
None.
Again, that's kind of a really tough thing to gauge.
I think maybe the only one would be Miles Rice. And
Okay.
I just don't think
I was
I
thinking
don't
him
think
or
any.
Mackenzie Mbako.
No, I that's one that typically, right. You just look all around the country. You see it with North Carolina with Elliott Cadeau, another 5-star McDonald's All American, right there. Well, it wasn't a McDonald's All American because he reclassified up, but would have been. But Mackenzie Mbako, any 5-star player who's kind of projected to be a one and done or projected to at least be a two and done is nowhere on draft boards after his second season with that program. There's no reason for him to come back. And I know that it's a new coach and everything, but he needs a fresh start. And I think Indiana needs a fresh start with what they're looking at. And he just does not seem to really fit in with what Darren DeVries' system kind of asks for. And it's a system that needs very physical players on the perimeter to play defensively the way that he wants to. And that's just not Mackenzie Mbako's style. I mean, we just saw with Mike Woodson, if you're not going to play defense, you're probably not going to see significant playing time in the critical stages of a game. So for Mackenzie Mbako to do that, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I really don't think, the only one, and he's not even in the portal yet, that I think could stay is Bryson Tucker.
Yeah.
He's the last one that hasn't announced anything. I think
And what's funny, real quick, what's funny about that is before things even began, there was rumors that he had already put his name in the portal, and then he came back, you took that back, and now he's not even in the portal at this very moment.
Yep. So I mean, that's one name that I think though could stay. We'll see what happens, right? I mean, again, he's a 5-star talent that things didn't pan out for whatever reason, and kind of a head scratching way that he just totally fell out of the rotation. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think his skill set and his athleticism and the way that Darren DeVries wants to play, I think that could be a good match. So we'll see what happens. But I think he's out of any of those guys that were there. I think he's the only one that I think could stay or theoretically come back in that sense.
When it comes to, I guess, kind of expectations for year one, this will be my last basketball question, by the way. Where do you think fans should kind of set the bar? I know that's also kind of a difficult thing to do when you don't know what the roster will really look like. You haven't seen them play on the floor, and you won't until November. But regardless of any of that, should there kind of be a baseline? Because I feel like through discussions with other people who have been on the show, it feels like if Indiana can comfortably get into the tournament, which they haven't been able to do. I mean, and I say the comfortably part's very important here. Indiana has not comfortably gotten in the NCAA tournament since the Tom Crean days, which is a very weird thing to think about. It's been that long. I think that's a very good baseline for year one of no matter who the head coach is, right? That's at least that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, but more importantly, just for this program, right? Especially the 2 years that they've missed in back to back. It's get in, and that should be it. You need to get back to building a program that's consistently in. In your down years, right? Maybe you're fighting on the bubble, but how many years now have we seen this program where, like you said, they're fighting to just get in, and they're nowhere near. Outside of the Trace Jackson Davis and the Jalen Hood-Schifino year, right? They have not even been a team that you look at. It's like, hey, that's a second weekend team, and so it's more so get in, build that foundation, and go from there.
Okay. Well, I do want to move over to do something that you and I haven't talked about in a while for these last few minutes, and that's talking a little Indiana football. And that's because you put something out the other day. You noticed something that a CBS Sports football analyst, I don't know, was it Tom Fornelli? I don't want to speak if that's okay. Tom Fornelli, he had made his kind of initial projections for some college football win totals, and he has Indiana currently at 8-4. Do you think that is a fair mark right now for this upcoming Indiana football team?
Yeah, I mean, I think 8 should be kind of the minimum. When you look at what they have returning, when you look at what they have coming in, and what you look at what the success was year one, I think,
Yeah.
the foundation and the core is still there. The obviously the majority, all but one of your staff is still there, and the core players that have been with this staff for now 4 or 5, even 6 years are still there. So it should be an absolute minimum of 8 wins. It was interesting to see how he built out the 4 losses because they were all the road games outside of Purdue.
Yeah.
Purdue was obviously the one road game that he slid in the win column for an 8-4 season. Obviously you go out to Oregon, you go to Penn State. Those are two incredibly difficult places to play. So, I think that's reasonable, right? But then I think the other two were Maryland and Iowa.
Yeah.
Maryland going through a bit of a transition period. I think that one was a little bit head scratching again. Who knows what these rosters again are going to look like after spring practice as well, and once you get into fall camp. But I think you can easily point at 9 wins and say that should be kind of the number you're looking at, because I just have a hard time believing that Indiana is going to go on the road and lose all of those critical road games.
Especially, I think they have a better chance in losing to like an Illinois in week 4 at home as opposed to losing to a Maryland on the road. And this may have nothing to do with anything, by the way, what I'm about to mention, but Maryland's athletic department is kind of in a weird place right now. They just lost their athletic director. Kevin Willard has been one of the shadiest people of the last few, or at least last few days, when it comes to this college basketball coaching carousel. So I'm not saying that's going to amount to things on the football field, but and again, that may have absolutely nothing to do with the result between Indiana and Maryland come next fall anyway. But it's just a very interesting thing, and it may just, honestly, that's going to be the popular thing to do from the national perspective. I feel like this year is to just assume that Indiana is going to fall back down to earth, and it very much could happen. I'm not trying to act like that Indiana is all of a sudden going to be a football powerhouse, but that's going to be the common narrative going into next fall, is that Indiana won't be a CFP caliber team. They're going to go back to being mediocre at best, right?
Yeah, and I mean that's what this program and this team now is set out to accomplish, is making sure that they kind of take away the narrative that last season was a fluke. And a lot of people are thinking that that's the case, but this team still has a very very large chip on their shoulder, especially with how the season ended. You look at the loss to Ohio State, look at the loss to Notre Dame, coming at the tail end of the season after gaining all that momentum through the first 3 quarters of the year. And Kurt Cinetti even talked about it too, right? Kind of them struggling and limping through the final weeks there. So I think this team is very very ready to come out and show that last season was not a fluke, but more importantly that this program is now elevated into a level where you can now talk about this team being a consistent top 25 team and a consistent top 2 or 3, at least vying for that 2 or 3 spot in the Big Ten almost every single year. Obviously, a couple years with how deep and talented the conference is, it's going to fluctuate, and you could be the 5th best team in the league, and you could still probably have 3 of those teams in the college football playoff and have 6 or 7 of those teams in the top 25, and that's still a very good season. But I think the upper echelon of that ceiling is definitely kind of top 3 of the Big Ten, because who knows now what Oregon's going to go through a little bit of a transition period, right? Next year, Penn State's going to go through a transition period with Drew Aller gone, not this upcoming season, but the year after, right? Yeah. So who knows what happens? Fernando Mendoza could stay. Obviously, he has 2 years, so it's vastly different than going out and trying to get another portal quarterback every single year. So there's a lot of things that could happen. But I think the way that this team develops under Kurt Cignetti and this staff has shown that last season probably is not a fluke, and this is probably more around the 9-win consistent team that you're going to see. So it'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward.
And we'll see. Less than a month away, we'll have the Indiana football spring game, which I tend to think that will, without a doubt, be the most attended spring game that Indiana football's ever had. So, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they look like. But Alec, I appreciate your time as always, and I look forward to the next time we conversate on the show.
Absolutely, John. I appreciate it.
A big thanks to Alec Lasley, as always, for his time and insight. And we look forward to many more episodes with him to come. But, maybe, with the changes coming, I'm sure there'll be really with every guest, we'll see them less often just because the frequency will change a little bit with everything. So appreciate Alec and everybody at HoosierIllustrated.com for all of their contributions to the show and to the site and all that good stuff. So I do want to talk a little more Indiana football stuff since that's what we wrapped up with Alec Lasley talking about. And we were just talking about, of course, the projected win totals, at least from CBS Sports. I do think you'll probably see, like, when you're thinking about betting odds and stuff like that, I think you'll probably see Indiana's win total set at about 8.5. I think that's very fair. Like, when you just think of where the national discussion will be at for that sort of thing, I would not be surprised. That's kind of where it would be. But you could also be like, and I'm sure the prize money would be a little bit different this year. Be like the guy who bet on Indiana to go to the college football playoff all the way in August, and you'll have a pretty nice payday. Maybe not nearly as good as his, but you very well may do that. And I think what Alec was saying about 9 wins, I think that's kind of going to become, at least until proven otherwise, that will be kind of maybe the baseline. Maybe 8 wins is the baseline. Like, you would still be disappointed, but I think if, like, 9 wins will be considered a good year under Kurt Signetti, right? And 8-4 isn't a bad year. I mean, it can be depending on how the losses come versus expectations, that sort of thing. But I think for any program outside of the true, always competing for a national championship type of contenders, outside of those guys, 9 wins will always be a good season. You'll be in a good bowl game. You won't be in the college football playoff more than likely, especially if you're Indiana. But you'll definitely be in one of the more premier bowl games. Heck, believe it or not, the Pop-Tarts Bowl usually features teams that are just outside of the college football playoff. Maybe Indiana finds themselves in the Pop-Tarts Bowl. And I don't know what made the Pop-Tarts Bowl such a competitive bowl game, but it is, and it's become one of the more memeable bowl games as well, as we've all known, or as we've discussed before. But hey, if Indiana ever plays in the Pop-Tarts Bowl, I'd be down for it. Now, it'd be disappointing that they wouldn't be in the college football playoff again, but we also have to remember that I think this is important, because I'll have to kind of bring myself back down to earth this fall, more than likely. Maybe I'm wrong, though. Maybe I'm wrong. But it's not going to be easy for any team, again, outside of the regulars, to make the college football playoff every single year. My friend Nick, who I've talked about before on this show, I used to work with him in the afternoons, Nick Coffey. He said with this new expanded 12-team playoff, for a lot of the, basketball type of schools, like Indiana, like those that, have their history more mounted in basketball than in other sports, specifically football, we're talking here, you can kind of chalk up a college football playoff appearance as an equivalent of making a Final Four. Now, some of you might hear that and think, well, how does that make any sense? Because the Final Four only has 4 teams, like the old playoff used to have, whereas the college football playoff now has 12. But I think it's kind of like the mark of, like, wow, you had a hell of a season. Even if you don't win the whole thing, you did about as good as you could have without winning the whole thing, right? And I think on football, it's definitely, again, at least for the basketball schools, and some of you probably, even myself, I don't even like saying basketball school. I don't like saying anyone is a anything school. But of course, we all know where, the root of that comes from for Indiana. But I think that's definitely a true statement, where if Indiana were to make another college football playoff, like if they're able to get to the CFP, once every few years, but they're always kind of in the conversation, I think it'll always be special to Indiana fans, right? And who knows how long Indiana is even going to have this luxury if you will, of being able to think that they'll be in the conversation each and every year. Because, yeah, Kurt Cignetti's awesome, and I'm glad that he's Indiana's head coach, and I'm sure you are too. But he's going to be 65 during this football season. And I know he shows no signs of slowing down, but, life creeps up on us all eventually. And I'm not saying that, I'm most certainly hoping that he would never, unfortunately fall under bad health. But the older you get, the more likely it is for something like that to occur. And so who knows if Indiana's got 5, 10, maybe 15 years of Cignetti. That'd be wonderful. He'd be 80 years old. But if Indiana's got an 80-year-old football coach still, that means he's done a pretty damn good job in all of the years prior. But I would even say 15 would be asking a lot for anybody to still be coaching college football or any sport. So Indiana's more than likely, I would say, going to get 10-ish or around 10 good years with Kurt Cignetti. But what happens after that, right? You'd hope enough would be established to think you wouldn't fall off too much. And maybe, Cignetti kind of starts his own tree of, those who will come after him. But I hope we as Indiana fans can enjoy this era of Kurt Cignetti Indiana football while we can, because who knows what'll happen afterward. Because before this, we all know where Indiana was. They had shown flashes of brilliance, if you want to call it that, before. It just never panned out. And who knows? I know I kind of dismissed the whole Indiana season was a fluke conversation with Alec, but we may find out this year that maybe, I don't want to say Indiana's season last year was not a fluke. You could just say they benefited from a favorable schedule if they, in fact, aren't as good as they were last year, this upcoming year. I'm hoping that's not the case, and I'm choosing to believe that's not the case until we see it. But I am excited about the spring football game coming up in less than a month. I don't know if I'll be there in person. I probably won't be. My wife will be very close to giving birth to our daughter at that point, if she has not already. So I will be more than likely watching the spring game from this house. Either way, though, I am looking forward to taking that in here in the very near future. And hopefully we have a lot of good things to talk about, because last year the spring game was our first impressions of Cignetti. And I remember kind of the big topic of conversation was like, okay, Taven Jackson looked better than Curtis Rourke. And little did we know that Curtis Rourke was going to end up being, can we say it, the best quarterback in Indiana football history? I think, and that's probably not even a stretch, right? Like, there's been other, like Antoine Randall is somebody who, like, you can't really make that. You won't ever have that kind of athlete in college football, or really in sports in general. I guess Travis Hunter is kind of similar, playing multiple positions, that sort of thing. But, and when it comes to just pure quarterback, and winning, of course, too, there's nobody who's ever come close, I guess. Well, I don't know who the quarterback was during the Rose Bowl season. But in the modern era, for sure, Indiana's never had anybody as good as Rourke. And I'm sure Fernando Mendoza's coming into this year thinking like, hey, I can make my mark, and I'm going to show you that this can be replicated in some way, shape, or form with a new quarterback. So maybe this is the start of something really awesome. And I think if Indiana can have another season similar or even equal to, or even better, why not just throw that out there, right? Than what happened last year, then I think at that point you can safely say, okay, this Cignetti era is for real. And, because here's the other problem with this. If he does it again, every year his name's going to get mentioned for the big jobs that open up. And I don't even really know where to begin when it comes to which jobs may open up this offseason that would be considered better than Indiana. I think Florida might be one of them, because Florida ended up not opening up this past year. But either way, hopefully we don't get to that point. But hopefully Indiana still continues trucking along with Kurt Cignetti. So with that being said, take another sip of coffee real quick. Let's go ahead and get into some YouTube comments from Wednesday's show. We're going to start with Five Lefts. He says, I haven't seen you on the comment section in a while, Five Lefts. I appreciate you being on here. He says, I'm friends with the senior manager on the team, and he said the players are really hurt by the way the media and some fans treated them. I don't think any of the starters will stay. I think you're probably very right about that, Five Lefts. I mean, there's probably not a lot of Indiana basketball players in general that have ever received the amount of negative, not even just on social media, but the booing at games and just the overall negativity. I mean, Mike Woodson got booed a lot. And guys like Trey Galloway, and I know both Galloway and Anthony Leal were out of eligibility, but man, they saw some of the worst of the fan base. Collectively, they didn't have the worst seasons ever in Indiana basketball, of course, but they may have been a part of some of this, just the least fun years of Indiana basketball, right? Archie Miller to Mike Woodson, not a lot of fun going on. There were moments and there were good seasons, but overall, this span of Indiana basketball for nearly a decade has not really been, we can say it, Indiana's not been relevant since the 2016 season. I'm talking about on a national level. Indiana's not been relevant nationally in what will be over a decade, or at a decade, when we get to this upcoming season. And it will be Darren DeVries' job to, fix that. So, but thank you for the comment, Five Lefts. Let's go to, this one's from Mr. Chedges. I think that's how you say his name. He says, stop acting like we hired a bum. He'll translate to the Big Ten better than McCollum. Jesus. He adds Jesus at the end. And actually, I responded this with a text reply first. So I'll just read that. I said, maybe we came across the wrong way, but I don't believe anyone made the assumption that DeVries is a bum at all. And I unless I'm mistaken, I don't think I mentioned that he's a bum. Now, maybe my conversation with Tyler Smith, maybe there were certain moments where I seemed, or maybe we seemed less confident in what Indiana will do with DeVries. And, if that's the case, then, so be it. But I think this other reply from Robert Swartz kind of sums up everything very nicely. He says, based on his record, DeVries is everything but a bum hire. Not everyone out there is as convinced he is a home run hire either, till he puts a team on the floor. No idea of what we have. That's 100% the truth. And John Fanta said that on Monday as well. Like, all we'll know up until we see this team play is how good they look on paper. And we did that this past season with Mike Woodson's portal class, if you will. And it didn't pan out. And I think the team that was pieced together was still good. I think we just learned that Mike Woodson he can't bring everything together as quickly as you have to nowadays. Like, things kind of figured themselves out as the season went along, but by that time it was too little too late. And that's not really the way things operate nowadays. But again, I appreciate both comments. Even Mr. Chedges apparently thought we were saying DeVries is a bum, and I don't think that. If you're watching, Mr. Chedges, I don't think DeVries is a bum. Another thing, this is a comment from Robert that wasn't a reply. He says, "Oh man, he says stunned my retort of a low bargaining mention. To clarify, let's hope DeVries can outdo Woodson in both overall record and results. If not, this hire will become a big question mark." Yeah, that's true. And if Indiana got it wrong with Darren DeVries, where do you go from here, right? I don't know. I don't really even want to have that discussion right now. I don't think anybody wants to have that discussion, because why talk about something that hasn't happened yet in a negative light, right? Especially when there's no reason to. But again, appreciate the comment, Robert. Let's go to this one. Agent All-Star says Beard was the slam dunk hire. Since it's not him, I'm fine with DeVries, I suppose, and glad it's not Brownell. Yes, especially, I think we should really highlight that last part. If Indiana had hired Brad Brownell, it doesn't. Here's the one thing. I think I've mentioned this before. No matter who Indiana hired, we were all at some point going to convince ourselves that whoever said person is, that they're going to figure it out, because we would say, oh, it's Indiana. They're going to put in the extra effort to really do a good job. And that's probably true, but they don't always get the type of results that they're hoping for. And especially with the way Brad Brownell and Clemson kind of exited the tournament, that would have been Ooh, thank goodness Indiana didn't hire Brad Brownell. Again, who knows? Maybe it would have worked out, but I think many people. My big thing with Brad Brownell was if Clemson can make a second consecutive deep tournament run, and I was thinking Sweet 16 at bare minimum, then my thought would have been, okay, yeah, maybe Brad Brownell's figured out what to do in this new era of college basketball, and maybe he is a pretty good head coach. He just needs to be at a place with better resources. That was kind of what I was telling myself. But they bowed out to McNeese, one of the few teams to really get upset this year. And they didn't really like they fought, but at the same time, they got down early in that game. And it's not really if you're a good team with a good head coach, you really shouldn't be in those positions very often, at least. So yeah, thanks for the comment, Agent All-Star. Appreciate it as always. And let's get into one more. Tanis, this is more about him answering who I should get on as a guest for the 100th episode. He said, ask Don Fisher, couldn't do more than say no. Here's why I'll tell you why I didn't ask Don Fisher. And it's nothing against him. He's just trying to make money. Don Fisher, I believe, is one of the few people that if I reached out to him, I think he has, like, you have to pay to have Don Fisher come on. Now, maybe if he just did it once, maybe he wouldn't charge me. But I do know for regular appearances, that I believe he comes at a cost. And again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Make a living, however you want to make a living. He's doing what he's got to do. But yeah, that's the primary reason that I didn't ask Don Fisher. Again, nothing against him, and I'm not mad about it. Just that's the reason that I wouldn't do that. At least not right now. Maybe if I ever have some more money at the disposal and I'm ever in a better position to do something like that, then maybe I'll do that. Let's see. That'll probably do it for comments today. But again, as always, keep them coming. We'll do more in upcoming episodes, even though they will only be once a week. And that'll allow comments to, really flow onto one episode, I guess, and really kind of have hopefully a good bank each week. That'll be nice if that ends up working out that way. And then real quick, before we wrap up, a quick update for baseball and softball. Earlier this week, Indiana baseball run ruled Bellarmine 13-0 in 7 innings. When did run rule start becoming a thing in college baseball? I know it's been around for a couple of years at the very least. Maybe it's been around longer than that, but I don't remember. Like, I've seen a lot of run rule results this year. I don't think that used to be the case, but either way, Indiana run ruled Bellarmine 13-0. And that improves their record to, 14-11, I believe. Yeah, 14-11. And this weekend, they've got USC for a 3-game series, 2 games being today. In fact, the first one will begin a little after the show gets released, and then the second of the doubleheader being later on tonight at 6. And then they'll play on Saturday as well, before having Louisville at home next week. That game will be on the Big Ten Network. And I remember I used to always go to Indiana Louisville games back whenever I was younger. So that's interesting to keep an eye on. And then for Indiana softball, they did not have a midweek contest, but they will be on the road this weekend at number 18, Ohio State. All those games will be on the Big Ten Plus, except for the game on Sunday. They'll be on Big Ten Network. And I didn't mention for baseball, I do believe I already closed out the tab, but I do believe all of the games for baseball this weekend are on Big Ten Plus. So, and also we got March Madness continuing on. I had a parlay last night. I can't remember if I mentioned that during Alec's segment or not. I know he and I talked about some of that stuff off air. But I had a nice parlay for the first time in a while. I had every team that covered the spread is what ended up being, right? Because that was Florida, Alabama, of course, Arkansas. That was something I had to sweat out right there. And then Arizona. And I did the same thing tonight. So if you want to get in on some action with me, if I'm indeed hot when it comes to the betting side of things, let me go. This will be how we wrap things up. I want to get this correct. I don't want to just throw it off the top of my head and be wrong. I want to pull up. I want to make sure I get each of the matchups. I want to refer to them correctly. But tonight I've got Ole Miss covering Michigan State, and that's solely because of Chris Beard, him being the head coach of Ole Miss. And it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't even surprise me if they won, but I've got Ole Miss covering Michigan State. I've got Kentucky covering Tennessee plus 4.5. Again, that wouldn't surprise me if they won outright either. I've got Auburn minus 8.5 against Michigan. And then with Purdue, Houston, I've got Purdue plus 8.5, I believe. So yeah, I got 3 underdogs and 1 favorite covering the spread tonight. Hopefully, I had a nice payout too. Hopefully, I can go 2 for 2 with nice parlay, but sometimes it's a little too good to be true for that to happen. So, but if you want to get in on some action, that's what I'm taking tonight for the Sweet 16 matchups, and we'll see how we end up doing. But that'll wrap it up for today's episode, and I look forward to being back with you all again next week. Again, quick reminder, beginning next week, 1 show weekly, and it may vary what day that show releases on. But the goal, as mentioned previously, is for it to be on Mondays or Tuesdays, but I don't want to say that definitively. You should never know when things might change. So until then, this has been the 100th edition. Did I even say that? Let's try that one more time. Until then, this has been the 100th edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.